Välkomna till Kungliga Vetenskapsakademin och den här presskonferensen. Vi ska presentera Sveriges Riksbanks Pris i ekonomisk vetenskap till Alfred Nobels minne för 2023. Welcome to the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and this press conference where we will present Sveriges Riksbanks Prize in Economic Sciences in Memory of Alfred Nobel for 2023. We will keep to our tradition and begin in Swedish and then continue the presentation in English. You are of course welcome to ask questions later on in either language. Jag heter Hans Ellegren och jag är ständig sekreterare här på Kungliga Vetenskapsakademin. Till höger om mig sitter professor Jakob Svensson, ordförande i kommittén för Sveriges Riksbanks Pris i ekonomisk vetenskap till Alfred Nobels minne. Och till vänster om mig professor Randi Hjalmarsson, ledamot i priskommittén och sakkunnig i ämnet. My name is Hans Ellegren. I'm the Secretary General of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. And to my right is Professor Jakob Svensson, Chair of the Committee for Sveriges Riksbanks Prize in Economic Sciences in Memory of Alfred Nobel. And to my left, Professor Randi Hjalmarsson, member of the committee and an expert in the field. Årets pris handlar om kvinnor på arbetsmarknaden. This year's prize is about women in the labor market. Kungliga Vetenskapsakademin har beslutat utdela Sveriges Riksbanks Pris i ekonomisk vetenskap till Alfred Nobels minne för 2023 till professor Claudia Goldin, Harvard University, USA, för att ha förbättrat vår förståelse av kvinnors arbetsmarknadsutfall. The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences has decided to award Sveriges Riksbanks Prize in Economic Sciences in Memory of Alfred Nobel 2023 to Professor Claudia Goldin, Harvard University, USA, for having advanced our understanding of women's labor market outcomes. Professor Jakob Svensson will now give us a short summary. Please.
Thank you. Over the last half a century, most high-income countries have witnessed a spectacular increase in women's labor market participation. The gender gap in earnings has also fallen sharply, at least since the 1980s. Still, even in countries considered the most equal, where women are more educated than men, women are less likely to work, and when they work, they earn less than men. Globally, but also historically, in high-income countries, women are and have been vastly underrepresented in the labor market. This year's laureate has provided the first comprehensive account of women's earnings and labor market outcomes through the centuries. Her research reveals new patterns, identifies causes of change, but also speaks to the main sources of the remaining gender gaps. Understanding women's role in the labor market is important for society, not the least because if women do not have the same opportunity as men, or they participate on unequal terms, labor, skills, and talent go wasted. Thanks to Professor Goldin's groundbreaking research, we know much more about the underlying factors driving women's labor market outcomes, and which barriers may need to be addressed in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Svensson. Professor Hjalmarsson, are you ready to give us a more detailed presentation?
Absolutely.
Yeah, please.
There are many differences in the labor market outcomes between men and women. Globally, about 50% of women participate in the labor market, compared to 80% of men. There's a gender gap of 30 percentage points. But even when women work, their outcomes are different. In OECD countries today, women earn, on average, about 13% less. And women are less likely to reach the top of the career ladder, hitting the so-called glass ceiling. It is quite a puzzle why these gender gaps still exist today, even though in many countries, women have overtaken men in educational attainment, graduating both high school and university at higher rates. Even though in many countries, policies like equal pay legislation have put in place to combat discrimination. The answer to this puzzle is important to maximize global prosperity. This map shows the gender gap in labor market participation rates in countries around the world. Darker shaded countries, red, have large participation gaps. Lighter yellow shaded countries have small gaps. We can see that there is a gender gap in labor market participation in all countries, but we can also see that this gap is much smaller in more developed high-income countries. In fact, this gap is much smaller today than it was 50 or 100 years ago. So one possible conclusion is that gender gaps will close with economic growth and development. But Claudia Goldin has discovered that this conclusion is not true, that economic growth does not always improve female labor market outcomes. In fact, she showed us that the long-run evolution of female employment over 200 years of US history is shaped like the letter U. Female employment first decreased with the economic growth of the 1800s, before increasing again with the growth of the 1900s. She also showed us that over this 200-year period, female earnings did not continuously catch up to the earnings of men, even though economic growth was continuous. While the gender gap in earnings did close substantially over the last 200 years, she shows us that this process was both slow and sporadic, punctuated by some periods of sharp change, like in the 1830s and 40s and the 1980s, but also long periods where the gender gap in earnings hardly closed at all. This was true for much of the 1900s, despite vast economic growth and increasing female numbers in the labor market. Before I tell you how she explains these patterns, let me tell you how she made these discoveries. She didn't look at just the last 50 or 100 years. She looked at more than 200 years of labor market outcomes in the United States, the long-run evolution. But through this historical lens, she could observe a society that has undergone many stages of development and transformations. She could observe a labor market that changed in structure from agricultural to industrial to office-based with machines like typewriters. She could observe changes in social norms and institutional barriers that, for instance, at one point explicitly barred married women from working in certain jobs, and then these marriage bars were abolished. She could observe a society where the access to education continually expanded, and where there were amazing medical innovations, like the birth control pill, that gave women the ability to time and control their own fertility. It is easy to say that we will measure 200 years of labor market outcomes. This was not easy to do in practice. For much of this historical period, systematic records of labor market outcomes, employment, and especially earnings, data did not exist. And for those years where these records do exist, this information was often missing for women. In this excerpt from an 1850 census, you can see that occupations were only reported for men. So how did Claudia Goldin overcome this missing data challenge? She had to be a detective to dig through the archives, to find novel data sources and creative ways to use them to measure these unknowns. But she did not only discover these data, and she did not only discover these unique patterns, she also discovered that these patterns throughout history could be explained by an economic framework. And in this framework, women are at the center of making a decision about whether to work in the labor market given their potential earnings, or to stay at home and care for their family and the home. The constraints that the woman faces at home, these have changed across generations, but also, as highlighted by Claudia Goldin, across the life cycle, as the woman goes from being young, single, and independent, to getting married, having babies, watching these children grow up, and eventually move out of the home again. Her potential earnings in the labor market This potential is in part determined by decisions that this woman made. Decisions, for instance, about how much education to get. Decisions that she made when she was a young girl. Decisions that she made as a young girl based on her expectations about her future career and family paths. But how are these expectations formed? These expectations are in part formed by looking to the outcomes of generations of the past. By observing, for instance, what my mother did in the labor market when I was a young girl. Claudia Goldin writes, each generation expanded its horizons, learning from the successes and failures of the preceding generation and leaving lessons for the next wave of women. This role of generations and updating expectations helps explain why change in labor market gender gaps has been so slow. The beauty of this framework is that it can explain all of the surprising patterns that she discovered in the data. She can explain why female employment decreased in the 1800s, despite the economic growth that came with industrialization. She can explain why the earnings gap hardly closed for much of the 1900s, despite continued economic growth and a large number of women returning to the labor market. She can explain why the gender gap in earnings suddenly started to close in the 1980s, and the surprising role of the birth control pill and changing expectations. And she can explain why the earnings gap has stopped closing today, and the role of parenthood. Claudia Goldin's discoveries have vast societal implications, and I don't think anyone says it better than Claudia Goldin herself. By finally understanding the problem and calling it by the right name, we will be able to pave a better route forward. She has shown us that the nature of this problem, or the source of this underlying gender gap, changes throughout history and with the course of development. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hjalmarsson. Let's see if we have Professor Goldin with us on phone. No, we shall see if we can get hold of her.
You are calling.
Professor Goldin, are you there? I talked to her an hour ago, so she's awake at least. No, it seems to be some problem with the connection there. So instead, we open for questions from the audience, and you are welcome to ask questions about the prize in economic sciences and the research involved to the committee members or to me if you want. Please, one here. Do we have a microphone?
You spoke to the laureate. What was her reaction when you told her about this news? And maybe a little bit also about the discovery. You mentioned right at the end that it's about understanding this problem will help us pave a way forward. What are the recommendations that she makes for societies to indeed reduce this gap even further?
Okay, the short answer first. She was surprised and very, very glad.
I think one thing to highlight about her research is that she does not explicitly study policy, right? She has described the problem, or the gender gap. It's not even clear that it is a problem without understanding why it exists. So she has demonstrated that the sources of the gender gap change over time, and understanding what's underlying it is the first step to understanding what one might want to do if one wants to do anything at all to affect it. And basically, it says, you know, you can't treat an illness with a medication without knowing what that is and what causes it. So she has provided this underlying foundation that has different policy implications in different countries and different contexts around the world, depending on the stage of development that they're at.
Please. You can use the microphone on the table there if you turn it on.
Thank you. We are in Chinese Nordic time. We see we have been through a very challenged economic footing this year so far. The tragic war in Ukraine and Russia, and high inflation rate affecting the people's life well-being in global wide. My question is, to what extent does this be into consideration in this year's proposal?
Yeah, I think the answer to that question is that it has not directly played in to the work of the prize committee. This is usually a process that takes time, and we gather information and take in information, and based on the information we get in and our own work, we then end up with suggesting a prize. But current affairs usually does not flow into that decision.
Please.
Hello, Bogomir Radecki, the Polish television, TVP Science. Last year's award was about economic crisis, and I wanted to ask, what does the Claudia Goldin's research actually tell us about the role of economic crisis regarding the position of women in the labor market? Thank you.
Do you want to answer?
Well, she has studied the role of women over 200 years. Through many stages of development, many stages that were not economic crises. We definitely do talk about, I think she has at least one study that's talking about sort of the depression. And it is also related to these marriage bars and when they were abolished. But it's not explicitly what her research speaks to, right? Her research is about the role of women throughout 200 years of history, and much of that time is not economic crises.
More questions? See no hands. And we still haven't got contact with Professor Goldin? No? Here's one question.
Yeah. I'm Shifichen Aksesong from Green Post and China-Europe Dialogue. My understanding of her description about women's career decision has great to do with the background of the person, or even where you are from. For example, in the developed world, then you have a better background, then maybe the children can have a better future or work. While you are in a poor country or poor family, then it's more difficult. It seems this kind of phenomena exist, and she just find out this. But I just wonder what's the solution or suggestion for closing this gap. I don't know if my question is clear.
I'm not sure your question is clear. For me, I understood it as whether or not these gender differences vary with economic background of the parents. Is that correct?
I think she described the gap, yeah. But did she give some kind of solution or any suggestion?
No. So, as I said earlier, she does not prescribe a solution. right? But she explains the source of the gap and how it has changed throughout history. That the source of the gap, back in the industrialization period in wages, that gender gap was not due to discrimination, but the role of discrimination changed as we moved to offices. Right, so she explains the source of the gap and how it's changed over time and how it varies with the stage of development. And therefore, there is no single policy. It's a complicated policy question, because if you don't know the underlying reason, a certain policy won't work.
Yes, please.
Carl-Johan Fonseth, Swedish Daily Dagens Nyheter. So this year's prize is about impediments to women's contribution to economic life, and this is in fact the third woman to receive the prize. Has the prize committee taken the opportunity to reflect on this topic on impediments to women's contribution in academia and economic sciences in general?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of questions you ask, both how we in the committee work, and there we do not take into account the gender or sex as a criteria in identifying potential prizes. When it comes to barriers in academia, I think Goldin's work is very relevant here too. Both when it comes to expectations, for instance, we know in my own field, economics, historically, very few women enter that profession, and why it has taken time to see changes, and we do see changes now, are issues that Goldin has worked and provided us with answers to. Yes.
Yeah. No more questions. If not, I say thank you for your interest for this press conference. But before closing, I would like to say that we will have another press conference here in this hall on Thursday, December the 7th. Then all our Nobel laureates will be here to answer questions from the media when they are here in Stockholm in connection with the prize ceremony. So December the 7th in the morning here. Thank you for your interest.